Alrighty. Here we are. I get to talk super fast now. All right. As we look at this tonight, the idea again is of this, making life count. Nobody really wants to waste time. They don't want to waste your life. Nobody wants to get to the end of life and say, well, it was wasted. Of course, we could look at the book of Ecclesiastes and say, as Solomon talked about, how easily we just kind of go through life and it's wasted, it's vanity, it's empty, and so many descriptions that he uses of people who are at the, come to the end of their life having worked and labored and toiled their entire lives only to have really nothing to show for it, and when life is over, life is over. His point in the book of Ecclesiastes is that in order for life to mean something or have value, that it has to have value outside of this life, which means we have to look to God for purpose and for meaning for the things that we do here in this life. And so it's no surprise that that's going to be part of the theme here when we talk about making our days count. So what do I need to do? What do I need to understand in order to make my days count? What we need, first of all, is we need to understand that God is eternal and that we are not. If I want my days to count, then I have to understand that God is eternal and I am not. There's a difference between eternal and immortal. We need to understand the difference between those two things. As human beings, we are immortal, or at least our soul is immortal because it will live forever. Our soul does. God, however, being eternal, means there's no beginning and no end, right? So there was never a point in time in which God was made or formed or created. So the difference between us and God, one of many differences, is God is eternal and we are not. Look at what Moses writes here. He says in verse 2, from everlasting, that would be everlasting past, to everlasting future, which never ends in either direction, which is hard for us to comprehend. You, he says, are God. God is constant, and what he identifies in verse 1 is that God is the constant dwelling place for his people. That's what he says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. So, as I said, we're going to tie in those events of Numbers 13 and 14 and the children of Israel in that time. So keep that in your mind. The dwelling, right? Lord, you have been. Imagine Moses saying that right after the Israelites have rejected God's promise of the promised land and they've chosen not to believe. Imagine Moses saying, you have been our dwelling place. Where exactly did they dwell before the wilderness? Was it their land? Was it their home? Since then, they've been in the wilderness, no dwelling place. Well, now they're going to spend the next 40 years with no dwelling place again. Lord, so that's why it's so incredible and awesome that he says, you are our dwelling place. You've probably heard, well, there's a song. Don't start singing it. It's an older song. This world is not my home, right? This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. Anyway, that idea that this world is not our home, you see, we so often make this our dwelling place. And we concern ourselves with this being our dwelling place. And the reality is that our dwelling place has to be in our eternal God. That's the only place we find refuge. That's the only place where we're ultimately going to find hope. And God has really, specifically here, God has always been Israel's refuge, no matter where they were. When but Abraham was wandering around as God was getting him to where he was, God was still his refuge. And so again, we're talking not so much about a place, but our refuge being in God. And again, before everything, God existed. That's why this refuge is so valuable to us. That's why it's so trustworthy, is because it's always been. It's always existed. It's not like it just came into being. You hear people, married people will sometimes say, "Oh, they're my rock." I mean, great if that's the case, but we're people, right? We're not perfect. We've got issues, and a lot of people, when they say that, are lying anyway. But the idea is, when God is our refuge, It's a sure thing. We never have to worry. We never have to wonder. God is faithful, and God is our refuge. He goes on talking about just how temporary we are. If you look into verse 3, you return man to dust. And this is going back to Genesis chapter 3. We were made from dust to dust. We will return, right? The dust to dust idea. We are temporary. Verse 4, God's transcendence over time, right? 1,000 years in your sight is as but yesterday when it is past. Now, people want to take phrases like that and try to turn it into somehow God is telling us what time things are going to happen, and it's not a measure of time. That's not what we're trying to be told. That's not what Moses is talking about. He's not trying to say that this is the rate of speed at which time goes for God as opposed to, he's not saying any of that. He's saying the point is that when 1,000 years has passed, seeing that God is eternal, 1,000 years isn't really a whole lot compared to eternity. It says, but yesterday, or even he says, as a watch in the night, 4 hours of time. So God is eternal. God is immortal, and we are not. Look at what he talks about in verses 5 and 6. He talks about the temporary nature of us, right? You sweep them away as the flood. People is what he's talking about. They are like a dream. In other words, kind of a memory. Once people are gone from this earth, it's kind of just a memory as a dream. He says, like the grass, it's renewed in the morning it flourishes and is renewed, and in the evening it fades and withers. It's almost just like that, People, not to be uncaring, if you will, but people come and go. Our lives come and our lives go. And quite honestly, since none of us even lives close to 1,000 years, our lives are so short in comparison with the eternal nature of who God is. We have spent, just this week, we've spent many hours at Little League baseball field waiting for rain delays and lightning delays to pass so kids can play some baseball. Many of the parents are very frustrated because they're saying things like, well, I could have done this, I could have been doing that, and some saying, well, we planned our vacation and we canceled it, or we took, we don't like to waste time. Maybe you've sat down before and taken this out of your pocket and gotten on some social media and just kind of done this, and next thing you know, an hour has gone by. All you've been doing is scrolling through social media. It's a waste, right? It's a waste of time. This life that we live can easily be a waste. It can easily be wasted. If not for our eternal God, this life would have no meaning, no reason, no purpose. Ultimately, when you think about a belief such as atheism, you're essentially believing that life has no meaning, life has no purpose. Whether you exist or not doesn't matter. When you're gone, it doesn't matter. That's the premise behind believing that there is no God. Because if there is no God, you're an accident and your life is meaningless. However, if there is a God and that God made you, things are made for a purpose. And God is the one who gives purpose and gives meaning to our lives. As we see, God is the one in whom we find our refuge as we go through this life. That place of safety and security, and again, of meaning. Our life might be short, but our eternal God has promised eternal existence with Him. And that's one of those things that makes our life count as we look forward to that eternal purpose. Another thing that we need to remember, if we want to make our days count, is that God is holy. We are not. God is holy, and we are not. If you look at verses 7 and 8, he starts to talk about anger, right? We are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath. We are dismayed. What's the reason for that anger and for that wrath? Just look at verse 8. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. What a picture, okay? Our sin is always in front of God, in the sense that God knows everything that we do, right? He knows all of our sin. And what he says there about the secret sins, you know, the ones that we try to hide, the ones that we try to keep covered up in a dark place, they are in the light of your presence. You can't hide anything from God, right? The sin of God's people in the wilderness was to reject God, right? To not believe God, not to trust God. Now, when we talk about a lack of belief or a lack of faith, that is an internal thing, right? That was the secret sin. It was made obvious as they acted and as they responded, as they chose not to follow God into the promised land. Their inner sin, their secret sin, became very obvious by their behavior. But God sees all of that. Israel had sinned against God by not trusting Him, and that generation, we see here, was going to be brought to an end. Look at verse 9. All of our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. These folks in 40 years, I mean, you know, it doesn't really matter how old you are. Well, I guess if you're less than 40 years old, maybe you think that's a long time. But if you're older than 40, you realize 40 years is not very long. 40 years as a sigh, he says. You know, and that's all they had. From the time that they rejected God, 40 years, and that was it. God was going to move to the next part of the plan. Look at the ages. He says here, the years of our life are 70. Now, 70 in that day was fairly old. Okay, people weren't living super long. We find a couple of people that lived longer lives, and it seems to be that was God's blessing and God's goodness to them. One of the things that's said actually about Moses is that when he was 80 years old, you wouldn't notice, right? He was just as strong, just as full of energy at 80. But it just wasn't a common thing then. He says they're a 70, maybe by reason of strength. Maybe if you're lucky, you're going to get 80 years, he says. But you have to imagine, again, all those 20 years and older were going to die in the wilderness. There were people that were never going to reach, the age of 65, for example. If you're 20 years old, the most you can hope for is to live till you were 60, because that would be the end of 40 years. But again, don't think in terms of, well, that 40 years was like some kind of a guarantee where everybody was guaranteed another 40 years. No. You might not live but a couple days after that. I mean, it doesn't matter how long in that 40 years, but that was just God's timetable. And Moses is saying here in this psalm, man, that would be a great thing, kind of an incredible thing. But even then it's still fast, right? The times, they're soon gone. Look at verse 10. Their span, even if it's 70 or 80 years, even if you live a long life, it's but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. It's just quick. It's quick. And here's the thing with that is God's wrath and God's anger being mixed into the equation. A lot of people don't have any trouble talking about God's wrath and God's anger, but we have to ask why. Why do we see God's wrath? Why is God, if you will, at times angry and wrathful? And if you look at the Bible, the answer is always the same. It's always sin. That's always the reason for God's wrath and God's anger. He's not like you and me. You get your toe stepped on and you get angry. Somebody cuts you off in traffic and you yell at them. God doesn't do that. God's anger and His wrath are always because of the sin of humanity. It's always the same. All we got to do is stop sinning and then there won't be a problem, right? Yeah, not going to happen. God is holy. That's why he is angry and wrathful at sin. We are not holy, which is why we are the object of that wrath of God when we sin. Israel's lack of holiness, when we think of these, again, the people there about to go into the promised land, and they decide not to. They decide they're not going to believe God. Israel's lack of holiness did not scrap God's plan. It didn't mean that, well, oh, too bad, I guess God can't do what he wants to do because these people were unholy, they were unfaithful. No, it doesn't work that way, right? It was simply going to be a matter of time. It just resulted, here's what happened, okay? When God's people chose not to trust him, when God's people chose to do what was unholy, when God's people chose to sin, what happened is they made a decision essentially to squander the rest of their lives. That's essentially what they were deciding to do. Because all of those people for the next 40 years were going to do nothing but wander. Never get anywhere. Never accomplish what God's purpose was for his people to get into the promised land. They were going to wander. They squandered the rest of their lives. And it was all a result of sin. It was a result of not trusting God. We could say, we still see the anger, if you will, the wrath of God. We still see that today. We still understand that those are still qualities that's still who God is, right? The holiness of God demands that there be that response to sin and to evil and to wickedness. The thing that we see, however, is that when God's people, and again, this is true of the Old Testament as much as it is of the New Testament, when people trust God and turn to him, and not only trust and believe, but that they obey him, when that happens, those people move from being under the wrath of God to being under the mercy of God, the blessing of God, the grace of God. We're no longer objects of God's wrath when we are being obedient to God. And the reason is because what we're doing is we are being holy as he is holy. When we're obedient to God, that's what, the closest we can get to holiness is to obey God and draw near to his holiness. For us today, we understand that by faith in Jesus, his Son, who died on the cross for our sin, paid the price for us, rose again, by putting our trust in him, we can move from that position of being under God's wrath. We are moved to his family, right? We are a part of God's family. We have been given his grace and his mercy. We've been given salvation through Jesus Christ. When we choose to trust and live in obedience to a holy God, no longer are we the recipients of his wrath. We become the recipients of his grace and blessing, again, through salvation in Jesus. And that is one of those things that makes our life count for something. It's not squandered. The last one, we're going to kind of have a few things that we're going to put underneath this. Our days are in God's hands. This is another important thing we need to understand. If I want, you got an extra word there. That's okay. You can figure that out. To make my days count, I need to understand that my days are in God's hand. Okay? Now we can say that, really easy to say. God's got control, my days are in his hand. Here's the problem, is that usually when we say that, we're kind of just dismissing, just what we have to do, what our responsibility might be. It's really just a statement that we make, hey, my days are in God's hands, just saying, oh yeah, whatever God decides is okay. As long as I live, it's all great. No. This statement, I want us to understand this statement in terms of how we choose to live life. If my days are in God's hands, there's a certain way I should live, is what Moses seems to tell us here, because he talks about, he kind of puts them in forms of requests or petitions that he would make to God. And these are, I've kind of just put them into 5 different ways. I'll put that up there. 5 ways to live your life in God's hand. Okay, so this will be, if you're taking notes, this is kind of under that third point. 5 ways that we live to live our life in God's hand. Moses puts these in the form of petition. You could probably divide up a few of them and say, well, I think there's 7, or I think there's 8, or I think there's however many, doesn't matter. We're going to cover them. The first thing that we need to do is we need to consider our days and use them wisely. If my life is in God's hand, I need to consider my days and use them wisely. Look at Moses said, teach us to number our days that we may get a heart of wisdom. To number our days is to consider the length of our life, right? It's important for us that we consider the length of our life. Not how long we will live, because we don't know, right? We can't really do that. I can say, if I live to be 65, if I live to be 75, if I live to be 85, I can't really do that because I don't know if I have that much time, right? So when I consider my days, I'm really talking about the day I've got, right? The day that God has given. Teach us to number our days. In other words, to count each day as valuable. Because here's the thing, is that when I count each day as valuable, if you will, or when I consider my days, he says that we may get a heart of wisdom. I need to think about the days that I have so that I can use them wisely. That sense that, and I think we probably typically have that, younger years of life. The thought that, we'll live forever. We don't worry about death. We don't worry about life ending. We don't worry, a lot of times even in the younger years, you're not worried about disease. You're not worried about, sickness. You're not worried about any of those things. You kind of feel invincible sometimes, in those younger years. But as we get older, we find that certain things just take a toll on the body, and we start to have to think about, that hurts, or that hurts for a long time. I just can't do the things that I used to do. So we start to think about those days, and as we do that, I think as we get older in life, we start to say, you know what? Maybe I don't have as many as I used to have, and I need to use them well, right? I need to use them wisely. Well, let's do that early. Really? If I'm going to say that my life is in God's hand, I need to understand that every day that's given to me comes from God. How do we do that? How do we use every day wisely for God? We could look at Proverbs 1, verse 7 that says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, or the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, to live in the fear of God. How do I obey God and trust God and reverence God today? That's this idea of considering my days, using every day and thinking of every day in light of how I can wisely use it for God. The second petition that he talks about here gives us our second answer. Pray for God's mercy and his return. And what I want us to see here is that if I'm living in a way that I understand that my life is in God's hands, it is going to affect the way that I do things. We can say, well, pray for God's mercy and God's return. You say, well, all right, sure, why not? We do that. We can do that easily. God, I hope you come back. Looking forward to Jesus returning. Lord, continue to be merciful. It's all well and good. But let's really think about what we're asking for there. I mean, he says it here, return, O Lord, and then he says, how long? How long is it going to be? I know you're coming back, but how long is it going to be? Now, Moses is not talking about Jesus, okay? We are thinking Jesus, right? Because that's the time in which we are. We're in the church age, and that's going to be the next thing, is that Christ is going to return, rapture first, eventually the second coming. Moses didn't have all that information. He is looking for, if you imagine again, the people in the wilderness, God has rejected them, right? And so he's looking forward to God returning. How long, O Lord, will you kind of walk away from us, if you will? Well, he knows it's going to be about 40 years. how long until you return, but we should anticipate the return of the Lord. For us, we're looking at the return of Christ. If I'm praying for Christ to return, how does that affect the way that I live? Well, if we simply look at the parables that Jesus tells of the master who goes away on a journey, right, and then he comes back, there's a number of applications that Jesus makes in those instances. Number one is to be prepared for him to return, right? We talk about the 10 virgins that had the lamps. Then there's the others who you need to be found diligent and working, right? You need to be found faithfully laboring when the master returns. You need to use what God has given or what has been given to you by the master and multiply it for when he returns. If I'm praying for God to return, I am living in a way, I want to live in a way that is ready for him to come back. I've used the same illustration before and it works really well, so I'm going to use it again. If parents leave and they give instructions to their children when they leave, the only way those kids want mom and dad to come back is if they've done their jobs, right? Otherwise, it's mass panic. Oh, they're pulling in the driveway. Hurry up, do the dishes, clean the floor. They're not looking forward to the return of the parents because they haven't done the work, right? If we're laboring well for Christ, we look forward to him returning. And so we need to pray for God's mercy and also pray for God's return. We need God's mercy, and as the writer of Lamentations tells us that his mercy is new every morning, right? But the greatest mercy of God is going to be when Christ returns, right? That's going to be the greatest mercy of God. Pray for God's mercy and his return. Find satisfaction in God each morning. Verse 14, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. This is the verse of all of this passage that if we're thinking about the Israelites in the wilderness, this is the one that's going to come most alive, okay? Here's why. He says, find satisfaction in God's unfailing love, right? With your steadfast love. Satisfies. God, satisfy us with your steadfast love every morning. The result of that is great. In the next line, that we'll rejoice and be glad all our days. I mean, that sounds awesome. Wouldn't it be great if every day was rejoicing and glad every day? Yeah. Some of us are going to have to get into character tomorrow morning, right? To rejoice and be glad. And no. Every day, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Well, that just sounds like that's wishful thinking. That can't really happen. Well, here's the thing. I think the timing is important. I don't think that the mention of morning is an accident. I think it's strategic. I think we see it a lot in Scripture. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. My suggestion to you is always going to be, begin the morning with God. I hear people, let me see, so I don't get in trouble. I'll quote somebody else, right? No, I won't. I won't throw anybody under the bus. People say, well, I do my devotions at night. I do in the evening. Great if that's the case. I mean, if you're doing it, I mean, that's better than nothing. I would just say, begin your morning with God. Moses emphasizes that. It was the quote that I was going to give you was Bible before breakfast. I won't say who that came from, but Bible before breakfast. In the morning, most people go through their day looking for satisfaction, right? What's the next thing that's going to happen, or the next thing I'm going to do that's going to bring some joy and some satisfaction? The person goes to work in the morning. they're looking forward to the end of the day, going to get some satisfaction because the job's over for today, right? Maybe they're looking forward to lunch because they're going to go somewhere special for lunch. But we typically go throughout our days looking for things that bring satisfaction. And we try to string together enough little things that satisfy so that by the end of the day we say, it was a good day. And if we don't string together enough little things that satisfy us throughout the day, we say, I don't know, could have been better, right? Moses isn't saying, get a little piece of your satisfaction in the morning with God. Satisfy. Completely satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love. Here's the thing. If in the morning your soul, your heart is satisfied, what does that mean for the rest of your day? You're already satisfied. So what are you searching for, right? I don't have to go looking for it because why? I'm already satisfied. I think this is a really big deal. Like I said, this is my favorite in this whole passage. And it's so simple because we can just look over it, right? Satisfy us in the morning. If I am fully satisfied in God in the morning, then quite honestly, the rest of the day could fall apart and I'm still satisfied. Now, I'm not trying to say that that's easy for us to keep a smile on our face. We'll talk about that in just a second. But when I open God's Word in the morning, when I look into His Word, when I spend time in prayer or memorizing Scripture, am I just doing those things, or am I being satisfied in God? So here's where it gets even better. If you thought that was good so far. Satisfy us in the morning. The Israelites in the wilderness, every morning they woke up and found something. Manna. Every morning they were satisfied in God. Theirs was physical, right? But Moses is saying it's a lot more than that. It's not just the bread. Moses is the same guy who said that you allowed us, God, you allowed us to hunger and suffer, and you fed us with manna that we didn't know where it came from, and our fathers didn't know where it came from, but you did it so that we would know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Are we satisfied? Sometimes we'll be faithful to open up God's Word, and we're faithful to pray, and we're faithful to memorize Scripture. We're faithful to do those spiritual disciplines, but have we found our satisfaction there? It's easy to just be searching for that satisfaction all day long. I'm just going to say a lot of times you're going to come to the end of the day disappointed, unsatisfied. I mean, what happens when that thing you anticipated doesn't happen? Now we're not satisfied anymore. I'm not saying don't look forward to stuff in life. Oh, hey, I spent time with God today. I don't really care what happens. It's okay to have satisfaction in excess, that more than what we receive from God, but that soul satisfaction is what we're looking at. When my soul is satisfied, having eaten the bread that comes from the mouth of God, then I can rejoice and be glad every day. right? Doesn't mean all days are joyous days. We have difficult days and challenging days and days where things don't go right. But if my soul has been satisfied in God, I can still rejoice in that day because God is the source of my satisfaction and not the stuff of this world. So, find satisfaction in God. Can I emphasize? In the morning, right? Be grateful. Next one is be grateful for each day. If my life is in God's hand, I should be grateful for each day. I've heard this 100 times before too. I mean, come on. Are we just, well, they are the same truths, right? God's word doesn't change. Be grateful for each day. I love the verse that this is put in. Make us glad, right? Okay, make us glad for as many days. If you stop there, okay. Rejoice and be grateful for the day. Keep reading. As many days as you afflicted us, for as many years as we've seen evil. Wait, God, make us glad for the hard days? Make us glad for our affliction? Make us glad for the years of our suffering? Now remember, they had spent 400 years suffering in Egypt, right? What we're saying here is these days that we are grateful for do not have to be great days. We can still be grateful. This generation in Israel, their days were going to be lived out with the daily reminder that our time is limited and we failed and we didn't trust God. That was what they were going to be reminded of. How discouraging. I mean, I would imagine that a lot of people, as soon as God kind of laid out the punishment and said, hey, actually, I shouldn't say I imagine. That's actually what happened. When God said, hey, you're not going in the promised land, 40 years you're going to wander, the people, after getting all, weepy and sorrowful, oh, wait, no, I think we can still do it. It didn't work. Their days were going to be lived out knowing that they had missed an opportunity to follow God into the promised land. But yet, Moses is saying, make us glad for the days that we have. Their only hope, as they would wander for the next 40 years, their only hope was going to be found in the fact that God had given them one more day. Because none of them were guaranteed one more day. But He had given them one more day. And so in that alone, they could be grateful. Our existence may not be thrilling. It may not be fun. It could be miserable. But if God has given us one more day, we are to be grateful to God for that one more day. You sometimes hear people say, when you're going through, or people are going through something difficult, you're like, well, it could be worse, right? It could always be worse. Just so you know, that's never a comforting thing to say to anyone who's struggling, just so you know. Okay? Please don't do that. If you want to say it for yourself and say to yourself, you know what, my situation could be worse, that's fine. But don't say that to somebody else. That doesn't help. But no matter how bad our existence is, we should always be grateful for that day that was given to us. Help us to be grateful. He says, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. Even if it's not great days, make us glad for those days. Our days are not guaranteed. Our days are not guaranteed to be great. But if we have a day, it's been given to us by God. When we're grateful for each day and we see it as a gift from God, it is much more likely that we will use it for Him. We could say, this has been a terrible week. I anticipate another terrible day. But hey, since I woke up this morning, God has given me this day. How do I serve Him? thankful, grateful for each day, because those days are in God's hands. The last one here, desire God's work to be done and to be a part of it. Okay? Desire that God's work is done and to be a part of it. Verse 16, he says, let your work be shown to your servants, your glorious power to their children. We want to see, is what he's saying. We want to see, God, you put your work on full display so we can see it. Jesus in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Same theme, same idea in this prayer. God, your work, your will be done. That's what Moses is praying for. Longing for God's will to be done and to be on display causes us not only to look for it, but also to tell people about it. When we see God at work, we say, man, look what God did in this situation. Look what God did in that. And that's the idea of it being on display. Let it be seen by their children. The second part of this is in verse 17, let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us. Establish the work of our hands. You see the contrast there? Verse 16, your work be done. Verse 17, establish our work. So the things that we do, and we would simply ask the question, well, what work does God establish? What work will God support or strengthen or see to completion? Well, His work, right? So the only way my work is going to be established is if I'm doing His work, right? If I'm living for Him, if I'm serving Him, if I'm doing things for the glory of God, that's the only way that my work is going to be established. So it's kind of implied that that's what they're talking about. As we serve you, God, establish the work of our hands. Our work without God's blessing is futile. It's a great quote. It's not mine, but it's also stolen from Scripture. Psalm 127, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. If God is not supporting it, it's worthless. There's no value to it if God is not supporting the work that's being done. So this is how, when we think about living our lives in God's hands, we have to consider our days and use them wisely. We might use that phrase, make every day count. But again, we're talking about making it count for God, right? Because He's the one who gives purpose to our days. Pray for God's mercy and His return. If I'm looking forward to His return, I'm also going to be doing things that make me ready for that. Faithfully serving, faithfully living for Him, telling others that He's coming back. Right? All of those things are involved. Find satisfaction in God every morning. Emphasis on morning. Begin your day with God. Bible before breakfast. Whatever you have to think about, get your satisfaction in the morning from God. Because if you don't get it in the morning, you're going to spend a lot of your day looking for satisfaction and seeking that satisfaction, only to find you're never going to be quite satisfied, because you'll probably get up the next morning and go looking for more satisfaction, right? Satisfaction is found in God. Find your satisfaction in Him, and then be grateful for each day. The emphasis here is there are sometimes not great days. There are sometimes miserable days. We're not grateful for each day just because we're supposed to be grateful. We're not grateful for each day just when it's a good day. We're grateful because God has given us another day. Even if we find ourselves in a miserable condition or a miserable place, God has given us another day, and we should be grateful for that day. And we also want to desire God's work to be done, and that He lets us be a part of it. That we have the privilege, the opportunity to be a part of the work that God is doing. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Covered exactly like what was going in my mind when I wake up in the morning.
Mm-hmm.